Hi students and welcome to week 14. This is the last week of the course. This week we're going to cover the history of modern China, basically the story of China in the 20th century, how China becomes one of the rising superpowers, one of the rising political and economic superpowers in the world. And we're going to begin with the collapse of the Qing dynasty in the early 20th century, and then we're going to look at the forces that step into this vacuum. Now, Chinese efforts to modernize were driven by as a response to the fact that China keeps getting defeated by these Western empires. And so China attempts to modernize and adopt aspects of Western technology, but along with that we have rising Chinese exposure to Western ideas, including the ideas of nationalism. And we talked about this a little bit last week with the Taiping Rebellion, with the Boxer Rebellion. These are all examples of Chinese people adopting the idea of the nationalist idea of self-government. The Chinese should be governed by the Chinese. And in the end, the viable alternative to the failing empire is going to be the Western idea of a republic. In 1911, the Wuchang Rising emerged in Nanjing, and one of the leading thinkers, one of the leading promoters of nationalism in China at the time, named Sun Yat-sen, rose to power and was elected president of an assembly of representatives from 17 provinces. And he promised, again, using modern Western liberal rhetoric, to overthrow the Manchu imperial regime and return China to the Chinese. In the end, Sun and his organization, the Kuomintang, which were basically the nationalist organization in China, lacked the power to overthrow the Qing. And instead, they overthrew the dynasty by allying with one of the Manchu generals named Yuan Shikai. Yuan came to power in 1912, and he ruled without a republic. So you have this Wuchang Rising that calls for a republic, doesn't have the strength to carry it out, but they're able to overthrow the Qing emperors and replace them with a military government. And so Yuan rules as a military government for 3 years. He attempts to dissolve the Kuomintang, so he attempts to get rid of the Chinese nationalists who had put him into power as being better than the Qing emperors, but this goes badly wrong. This leads to an uprising and he is forced out of office. There then follows a period where there is no recognizable government in China. The unified government of China breaks down, and China is governed by a series of different warlords who rule different regions of the country. Sun Yat-sen returned to the country from exile. He'd been exiled by Yuan Shikai during his 3-year military rule, but still was not able to unify the country and dies in 1925. His successor as leader of the nationalists, as leader of the Kuomintang in China, is named Chiang Kai-shek. Chiang Kai-shek leads a successful expedition against the warlords in the north, and then attempts to purge the Kuomintang of communists. So basically you have the rise of Western ideas in China. You have a desire to overthrow the traditional imperial rule in China and that imperial structure. And bound up in that nationalist movement, you have both nationalists and communists. They all want to promote more liberal Western ideas. The communists are just more extreme than the nationalists are. And so now you start to see that this movement is increasing, and Chiang Kai-shek tries to get rid of the communists. He says, we want a nationalist government for China that adopts some Western liberal ideas, but this whole idea of destroying the whole culture, seeing the whole culture as oppressive and trying to destroy it, we don't want to do that. We just want a Chinese rule of China. We want to maintain ideas like a Confucian system of government and meritocracy and hierarchy and respect for authority. This is antithetical, of course, to Marxism, which sees these traditional sources of authority as oppressive. And so Chiang Kai-shek tries to drive the communists out of the Nationalist Party. He's largely successful in doing so, but then they form their own separate Communist Party and establish their control in the south. Nevertheless, by 1928, Chiang Kai-shek had successfully defeated the separatist warlords in the north, and he declared the unification of China complete. Kuomintang had stated that their plan was a period of military rule followed by the implementation of a constitutional democracy. So now they say, we've used the military, we've gained control of China, and now we're going to establish a democratic constitution with a national bank and a national academy. This program, however, was disrupted by the Second Sino-Japanese War that began in 1931 when the Japanese invaded Manchuria. And we've talked about this invasion before from the Japanese perspective. To set it in the Chinese perspective, the Japanese invaded Manchuria claiming that they had with them a relative of the Qing dynasty. They were going to re-establish the Qing dynasty ruling over China basically as puppet rulers controlled from Tokyo. As the Japanese push further and further south and have great success and sack and rape the cities of Shanghai and Nanjing, the Kuomintang, led by Chiang Kai-shek, become more and more unpopular. They're seen as more concerned about the communists who are still trying to disrupt and overthrow the government than they are about the Japanese who are doing all these terrible things to the Japanese. And so eventually, Chiang Kai-shek is forced to agree to a ceasefire. Despite the fact that it seems as though he was about to fully defeat the communists, he's forced to agree to a ceasefire, and he's forced to agree to the unification of communist and nationalist parties in order to fight against the Japanese invaders. The nationalists receive significant support from the United States. Soviet Russia gives the communists significant support. Nationalists are able to seize most of China back from Japan at the end of the war. But what's important is that Soviet Russia and Soviet Russians seize control of Manchuria in the northeast. When they do so, they don't turn the weapons and the military technology that's there from the Japanese that was very advanced for the time, they don't turn that over to the nationalist government, to Chiang Kai-shek, as they were supposed to do. Instead, they turn it over to their fellow communists in China. And so this means that the communists have military technology that they can now use to resume their civil war. And so they do so. The nationalists have been exhausted from fighting against the Japanese. China itself is exhausted, and so the communists are able to seize Beijing, to defeat the nationalists, and to declare the People's Republic of China in 1949. And so this brings to an end a period of civil war and confusion that followed the fall of the Qing dynasty, that killed between 2 and 3.5 million people. And it results in the end in a communist takeover, a communist seizure of power in China. In 1949, the civil war in China has come to an end. Now the communists who have taken control in China have the responsibility of trying to implement communism in China. And China, of course, is in ruins after this long period of civil war and invasion. But the peasants who have fought for Mao Zedong, the leader of the communists, are excited by the prospect of new freedoms and new wealth that they've been promised. They've been promised rise up against this old system of hierarchies that hasn't done anything for you, and instead you can be part of this utopia of equality that communism always promised. But remember that in the background of this, China is still a highly traditional society. And in this highly traditional society, heavily influenced by Confucian philosophy, relations between family members are or continue to be extremely important. Mao Zedong's goal is to fully industrialize China. And we've seen this with Stalin in Russia. These new communist regimes feel that in order to demonstrate the self-sufficiency of communist regimes. The communist regimes work. They have to industrialize. Industrialization is the way for them to create a military force that can resist any efforts to overthrow their communist regimes. And also they're bound by the narrative of Marxist history, which is a deterministic narrative that says that in order to reach the communist utopia, you have to pass through an industrial stage. China was far less industrialized than Russia when the communists took over, but Mao is seized by a sort of rivalry with Russia. The same is true with the other Chinese communists. They want to show that they can outproduce Russia. They want to show that they are better than the Russians at making communism successful. And so they give land to the peasants and encourage them to seize property from their landlords. So those who already owned land were beaten, dispossessed, killed, or humiliated, and peasants received up to 3 acres of land per household. And so it's now, you could say, well, it's more equal. As landlords were part of an oppressive system, everyone should have a certain amount of land. But the destruction of the landlords means that there's no kind of intermediate group to protect ordinary Chinese people from the state if the state starts to become repressive. Citizens were encouraged to inform on other citizens and say, this person is hoarding money, this person has savings, or this person is owning a business that's larger than the sort of 3 acres of land that a peasant is allowed. And again, it's encouraging citizens of China to view themselves as having a loyalty only to the state. Again, this is something that has a little bit of a history and a background in China. We think back to legalism, we think back to the Qin dynasty. This was a long time in the past, but it has an important legacy, it has an important memory. And so this idea of a powerful state in China, that you need a powerful state to govern a large population, that has some currency. So people are willing to go along with this, at least at first. Now, the government encourages families to form cooperatives in order to produce more food. So they say, okay, we've given each of you 3 acres, but you're going to produce more food for this large population, which is necessary if we're going to industrialize. We want to be able to take members of the population away from farming in order to build factories. And so we want you to kind of pool your resources together and form these cooperatives in order to make more food. Again, the peasants are excited by the new opportunities, so they're willing to go along with this. And by 1955, about 66%, it was estimated by the Chinese government that about 66% of the population had joined one of these cooperatives. And this was actually ahead of schedule and ahead of expectations. And so now the Chinese communists go ahead with the next part of the implementation of communism. So the idea is we've given something to everyone. Everyone's received their 3 acres of land. Everyone is equal, but now everything needs to be controlled by the state. And so the government come and they say, we're going to now control how your tools and how your land are used. We're going to give you kind of a basic income, but then we're going to control how that basic income is used. And the peasants start to become a little uneasy about this. We're now entering a period where the peasants are under direct government control for the first time. Previously, they'd always been under the control of local rulers or local landlords. While these people might be oppressive, they certainly had a close or unjust in their rule in some areas. They certainly had a close connection to the region. That's been stripped away with the destruction of the landlords. And so now there are no protections for the Chinese except, or ordinary Chinese people, except to follow the dictates of the centralized communist Chinese government. And so they have to sell everything, and they quickly find that state control of China is worse than control by the Chinese landlords. So this early promise now starts to be tempered by the realization that they are now under a much more powerful, they are much more closely controlled by a much more powerful government than the Qing government had ever been. And we'll talk about some of the ramifications of this in the next video.